Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
The reason that the Spirit of God gives us Exodus 19, I think we Christ followers understand the difference between us and God, but still yet our self-image continues to be based largely on our virtue. But Exodus 19 is trying to remind us that if you were to actually see yourself beside the holiness and righteousness of God, you would have a self-quake. You would begin to self-disintegrate.
Today with Jeff Vines, pastor, apologist, and Bible teacher.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Today with Jeff Vines. In this series, Ghosted, Pastor Jeff is talking about the times we feel ghosted by God and he's suddenly distant. This term ghosted is a modern social media term, but as we look into the Bible, we can see what happens when it seems God is distant. Let's get into it now. Here's Pastor Jeff to begin today's message.
Exodus 19, here's how we continue the story. The Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said, and the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. Now he goes on, keep reading. This is the word of the Lord now given to us because he loves us. After Moses had gone down to the mountain to the people, or gone down from the mountain to the people, he consecrated them. They washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood on the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it with fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke and the voice of God answered him. Now the visual and auditory effects here are astonishing, and closely connected with this verse or narrative is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 18 through 21. This account is actually recounted in the New Testament, where the author says, you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm, to a trumpet blast, or to such a voice speaking words that those who heard it begged that no further word be spoken to them, because they could not bear what was commanded. Even if an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. The sight was so terrifying that Moses said, I am trembling with fear. So what's happening here? Because this sounds quite serious. In fact, 7 things are mentioned in Hebrews in reference to this narrative in Exodus 19. Fire, deep darkness, gloom, storms, thundering, lightning, trumpet blasts. And worse yet, God actually says, don't get too close because I might have to kill you. You might perish. Every time I read the narrative, I go back. When Lucy asked the question concerning Aslan, the Christ figure portrayed as a lion, a mighty, powerful lion in the Chronicles of Narnia. And she asked the question concerning the Christ figure, is he safe? And the response comes back, safe? No, who said anything about safe? He's not safe. God appears to Jacob as a powerful wrestler, Job as a hurricane, Moses as a blazing fire, Joshua as a man armed to the teeth, Ezekiel. As we read that, we're not even sure what Ezekiel actually saw. Some commentators make a pretty good case that he just lost his mind. He was so overwhelmed, he could not put into words what he had seen when he had witnessed the power and majesty of God. He was traumatized. Moses said to God, this same God in Exodus 19, show me your glory. And God said to Moses, well, I would, but it would kill you. In other words, in the words of Tim Keller, God is not a warm fuzzy. Now, this is so antithetical to the God that we often portray in Western culture. What is God, or why is God so terrifying? Why are the people in Exodus 19 trembling? The nature of God doesn't even have to be visual or auditory in its accompaniments. If you think about it, even going all the way back to the garden, God comes to Adam as a companion, walking in the garden of the cool of the day. And yet Adam is terrified. He's hiding. He's afraid. He's shaken, fearing for his life. And we began to realize that the reason is because Adam had sinned. And suddenly his eyes were opened to the true contrast between Adam and Eve and God. Now, let's take a breath here for a moment. Let's build this stage again. And I think if you'll stay with me here, a powerful, penetrating truth will come out in the end that will encourage you, actually, even in the midst of all this volatile language of power and fire, tornadoes, and a warrior armed to the teeth. The reason that the Spirit of God gives us Exodus 19 is that, unfortunately, you and I have a very difficult time learning something. We are actually in such deep denial about how bad that we really are when we are contrasted with God. You know, I told the story a few years ago about one time I was in Florida and I was warming up to play in a charity event on a golf course called Isleworth Country Club. It's a very private club in Florida. I was actually invited by Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So I started to warm up on the range, and after I'd been there for about 5 minutes, Tiger Woods actually walked onto the range and started hitting balls. I couldn't believe, why is Tiger Woods here? I found out later this is his home course. He comes out in the morning, hits some balls, and then continues with his day-to-day routine. But when Tiger Woods came to the golf course and started hitting balls behind or beside me, I immediately stopped hitting balls. Man, you don't want to be hitting golf balls beside perhaps the greatest ball striker of all time. The contrast and comparison would just be too much. I think we Christ followers understand the difference between us and God, but still yet, our self-image continues to be based largely on our virtue. So somehow we say to ourselves, you know, I'm a good person, I work very hard, I try to do the right thing. That's got to be worth something. But Exodus 19 is trying to remind us that if you were to actually see yourself beside the holiness and righteousness of God, you would have a self-quake. You would begin to self-disintegrate. I've also shared with you in the past a goat that we have in Tennessee called the Tennessee fainting goat. It's actually a myotonic goat. They're actually bred. It's a hereditary condition. These goats just fall over when they're startled. They just faint. It's quite humorous. If you and I really knew who we are and who God is, we would not be able to stand up in His presence. We say that we do because we're supposed to say that. That's what Christians do. We say, yeah, we know we're saved by grace through faith, and oh, thank God. But if we could actually see ourselves in comparison to the holiness and the righteousness of God, we would actually see what sniveling cowards we really are. If we could see the depths of cruelty of which we are all capable, we would die. The self would disintegrate. We would have a self-quake. Because our self-image, no matter how hard we try to say it, no matter how often we try to say, I know that God loves me and values me and treasures me, the fact is that even the most mature Christ follower, down deep inside, rests or regards their self-esteem on the basis of their ability to look in the mirror and say to other people, I'm a pretty good person. I remember, again, about a year ago, I noticed there was a man that attended quite regularly on a Saturday night, and suddenly he went missing. And I hadn't seen him for months. So I walked down after the service one Saturday evening and I asked a friend of mine, hey, have you seen so-and-so? And they said, yeah, he's not coming anymore. Now, this was after a season I had spoken about the grace of God and how much God loved us and the fact that he sent his son and how he reached down to us to make us his treasure so that we would make God ours. And the answer that came back really startled me. I almost had a fainting goat experience. He said, yeah, he decided not to come back to church anymore because he got tired of hearing how bad he was. And I thought, wow, but this was after a season where we had talked again and again about the grace of God and the love of God found in Christ Jesus. But the reality is, the closer you get to Jesus, even though you know you're saved by grace, the more apt you are to probably have a self-quake. The closer you get to the love of God, the closer you also get to the holiness of God. And when you compare yourself with who God really is, the self can begin to disintegrate. You know, I read an article not too long ago about counselors at an Ivy League school, and they're under tremendous pressure because the kids that come to this school are the smartest kids in America. They've got nothing but A's all of their lives. So over the years, they start to cling to the idea that they may not be good looking, they may not be athletic, but they're really smart. They're the smartest person in the hometown in which they grew up. So it becomes part of their identity. Their self-assurance, their self-esteem is directly tied to this idea that I'm smart, I'm smarter than everybody else. And then they arrive at Harvard or Princeton and Oxford, and suddenly they realize that, man, I'm not the smartest one here. I can't even keep up with the smartest people in America. They realize they're average, they're mediocre, and at worst, failure. And what happens, this article says, they have a self-quake. They've been comparing themselves all of their lives to a very low standard, and suddenly the standard is not only higher, but unattainable. And they say to themselves, I can't do this. I can't measure up. I'm doomed. And they end up on the couch, suicidal. Now, and we're going to labor this point. It sets the stage for understanding of Exodus 19. If getting into the presence of human superlativeness practically decimates you, then what must it be like to get in the presence of a holy God? That's what happened to Isaiah. Woe is me, I'm undone. That's what happened to Peter. Depart from me, I'm a sinful man. Even a glimpse of the presence of the real God causes a self-quake, a soul disintegration. The holiness of God causes you to shrivel up. The beauty of God causes you to feel ugly and tainted. And it's only when you wake up to this, you talk about woke, only when you are woke to the ultimate character and holiness of God will you get away from this idea of creating a God in your own image, conveniently concocted by what you think God should be. And only will you overcome life's greatest temptation, which is this, to create a God in your own image so that the self could remain intact. Let me go back one more time, stay with me now, and read this quote by C.S. Lewis. I'm going to move quite slowly through it because I want you to gain the power of the punch here. Lewis says, an impersonal God, well, we like that well and good. A subjective God of love and goodness inside our heads, better still. A formless life force surging through everyone, a vast power which we can tap, best of all. But God himself alive, pulling at the end of the cord, approaching at infinite speed, the hunter, the covenant Lord, the husband, that's quite another matter. There comes a moment when people who are dabbling in religion suddenly draw back supposing they had really found him, who never really meant it to come to that. Worse still, he found us. If there is a God, you are in a sense alone with him. You cannot put him off with speculations about your neighbor's hypocrisy or memories of what you've read in books. What will all that chatter and hearsay count when the anesthetic, I love that word, the anesthetic fog we call the real world fades away and the divine presence in which we have all stood become palpable, immediate, and unavoidable? Lewis says this is a fiery God who shakes the mountains and the people tremble. But oh yes, that's not the end of the story in Exodus 19. All that imagery, all for that one meaning, that God is far more holy and righteous and just than you can ever imagine. And if you were to ever be in his presence, you would become undone. Thank God, though, the writer of this Exodus narrative reminds us that God does not just come to us in fire. You with me? Everything I've said up until this point, God does not just come in fire, but he comes in a cloud. The climactic verse of Exodus 19:9 is this. The Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud. The presence of God is actually impossible to bear. So what then is the purpose of God coming in a cloud? What's up with the cloud? One commentator says, he is shrouding, not abandoning his glory, so that he could accommodate himself to live among his people, to grace them with his presence, which its awful holiness would otherwise spell their destruction. Even there, he is showing, I still want you in my life. I just love this. You know, we're nearing Christmas. One of my favorite Christmas cartoons is Frosty the Snowman. Always has been. I don't know why. I think it's when he says, happy birthday so many different times. But if you know the story, if Frosty comes too close to Karen, then he will disintegrate because she lives in too warm of a climate, so he has to leave Karen. He must give up nearness to Karen to save himself. But for God, it's different. God must give up nearness to us to save us. He must shroud himself that we might not disintegrate. And yet, Exodus 19 reminds you that God said, that's not good enough. I want to be in your life. I know we have a problem. A sinner cannot live in the presence of a holy God, but I want you still. I love you still. And the question that is answered by Exodus 19, reiterated and explained in Hebrews, is that God comes to us both in a fire and a cloud in order that he can meet with us. But in order to meet with us, Moses has to go down off the mountain. Now the question is why? Do you see that tension? Because if you never see this tension, you'll never understand the gospel. In the past, I have heard people say, hey, if God really loves me, then he can do whatever he wants. He can just save me and take me to heaven. Listen carefully. No, he can't. See, you're talking about a matter of power and ability, what God is able to do. But there's also the side that talks about the nature and character of God, which also cannot be violated. God cannot use his power and his ability to violate his own nature. That would be an internal contradiction. And so when God looks at you, his holy character and nature requires him to separate himself from you and to bring judgment on you because you are a sinner. I am a sinner. And if we were to ever get into the presence of a holy God, we would self-destruct, disintegrate, self-quake. But God also loves us. And because he loves us, he does not want our soul to disintegrate. He does not want a total destruction of the soul and the self. So the question then becomes, how can God remain true to his holiness, which means that we are separated from him. We are the objects of the wrath of a holy God, and at the same time, love us to bring us in, to bring us near, because God says, I want you in my life. And the solution is found, believe it or not, long before the gospel. The solution is found in Exodus 19, verse 21. What is the answer? The answer is a mediator. Someone to mediate between you and God, the holiness of God and the sin so present in you. In verse 21, go down, Moses, and warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. So in the story, you have people trying to rush up the mountain to approach God on their own merit. They think they can just waltz into the presence of God. And God says, no, Moses, tell them not even to touch this mountain. They cannot come into my presence. Moses, you go down. You tell them if they approach me like that, they're going to die. They can't just waltz into my presence as if I'm their next door neighbor. They are a defiled people, unclean lips and unclean hearts. And they're delusional. And we know that because in verse 8, when Moses tells them all that the Lord had said, they send the Lord back an answer. Tell the Lord we will do everything that he has told us to do. Really. Hey, do you remember a few years ago we did a message or a series on Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement. And God said to Moses, you tell the priest when he enters into my presence to atone for the sins of the people on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, you tell him he can't just waltz in here as if he's meeting with one of his pals. You tell Aaron, I want him to wear the sacred linen tunic, the linen garments or undergarments. A linen sash is to be worn around his shoulders. And you tell him I want him to participate in the mikvah, the bath. I want him to wash himself head to toe to be clean when he waltzes into my presence. I want him to come in without blemish. And Aaron took all of this unbelievably seriously. He actually ends up assigning someone to keep him awake all night so he doesn't fall asleep and have any inappropriate dreams. In fact, a wife would be waiting for him in the wings in case his wife died during the night. He immediately would be remarried so that no stain of death would come upon him. God said, you tell the priest, I want him clean. I want the tabernacle clean. I want my people clean before they approach me. Now go back to the mountain. God says, okay, you tell the people to purify themselves, but they still can't come up. Instead, Moses, you go down. Moses becomes the mediator. The man on the mountain is the man between. And he goes down to the people. And he's the one that keeps them from perishing. Now watch this now. This is so good. I mean, this is the gospel told over generation over generation. Hear it again maybe for the first time. Even if you're familiar with this text, listen again. And perhaps it will resonate with you for the first time. Hebrews 12 verses 18, 22 through 24 describe what happened in this account all the way in the book of Exodus hundreds and hundreds of years before. You have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm. But now you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in the joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. God said to Moses, go down, Moses. And now we're told that God said to Jesus, go down, Jesus.
You've been listening to Today with Jeff Vines. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we'll bring you the rest of this message from Pastor Jeff.
The message of Exodus 19 is that you live with this overarching joy. You live with this incredible, overwhelming sense of security because your hope is not in yourself, but is in Christ. It means now there is nothing in your life, nothing that the power of God cannot be poured into.
You can listen to more messages like this. Just search for Today with Jeff Vines wherever you get your podcasts.
You make me wanna dance and sing with every single breath I breathe. I will bring this offering. You are my wonder, you with the wonder.
Today with Jeff Vines.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.